Good morning. I start right away because they've stolen a minute or two from me now. And what plants can do? You see here this plant, what can plants do for design? This plant, for instance, is a tree, but can communicate. But it's an artificial tree, of course, you can see it. But if we talk about planting design, then there is landscape and architecture in the past had to do with horticulture, botany, the fine arts, and parks. That was in the past. Today, landscape architects are involved in architecture, urban design, and public infrastructure. That is a big difference. Students feel nowadays more challenged by the architectural part of the profession. And planting design in the context of the garden, we all know, is mostly driven by decoration and moves on trends. Every year another garden, every year something different in your garden. But planting design in the public realm should help to restore and maintain a relationship between people and their environment in the context of a fast-changing world. And I think there's so much lost in planting design through the years, and it is a long story, but I will start right away with where we live in Hummelo. It's a farmhouse. We have 3 acres, 1.5 hectare. This is how we found it in 1982. We came in after having a design studio, planting design or garden design studio in Haarlem. We felt, me and my wife Anja, we felt that we were just at the end of our career if we didn't do anything, escaping the space we had. It was very small, so we moved to this farmhouse. We traveled a lot in gardens and places. We wanted to bring our collection over, starting a little nursery so that we could provide ourselves with plants we needed for our garden design, which was at that time more on a residential scale. So small gardens, a little bit bigger, small office gardens. This was our last holiday in Sweden, so you see we're just at the brink of starting a new career. I can tell you it took 6 years before we could start designing again, and we started to build up a garden. We collected plants from botanical gardens, from seed from botanical gardens, from all over Europe, plants that were lost, plants that we liked, plants that we, not conventional. It was a big lack of variety in plants. And I had a very strong idea that I could do something very personal with this material. So not only infrastructure, which I had to do, of course, for the residential design, but also I saw plants as a tool to express myself from the very early beginning. And I came into this profession when I was 25. I came from a business of restaurants and hotels from my parents, and suddenly had the idea when I was 25 that I should change my career. And this is how we built it up, a garden that was open for the public, a nursery that was run by my wife Anja, and I was doing, after so many years, garden designs again. We changed the garden 3 times. We changed our ideas about garden. Traditionally, gardening was what I said about, or what you could read about decoration. And we wanted to escape this sort of rules and dogmas of traditional gardening. So we wanted to make gardens that felt a little bit more free and more spontaneous and more wild. And one thing about wild gardens, there was a big movement in the 70s that didn't work because plants can rule, let's say you can only work on smaller spaces when you know the habitat or you know how plants grow, that one plant will easily overgrow other plants. Some plants are biannual. Some plants are long-lived, some plants are just annual, some plants are rampant, other plants stay put. So there's a big thing. Some plants show only for a week, other plants for 3 months. So you need to know your plants to create something with it. So our sources, we travel a lot. And if we talk about today, landscape designers seek inspiration from a variety of sources, and among this, nature is perhaps a relatively recent choice. I just read it from paper, it's easier, but you can read it with me. It is a reflection of changing attitudes to the natural world. And I came to travel in America in the 2000s for a competition we won on Millennium Park. And that was just a picture, but I was already traveling to countries. This is Yugoslavia in the 90s, just before the war, and you see they burned their fields, and I was just rescuing hellebores, digging them out because they were very, nowadays everyone that gardens knows hellebores, but at that time they were very rare, and I was collecting them. You see, this is how easy and lovely and romantic it looked. But it was just maybe 1 week before the war started. I traveled to the Northwest Pacific, met plant hunters in very small nurseries on islands. We were talking, you see, with Roy Lancaster, one of the most famous plant hunters in the world, ever was and still alive, and other people from Texas that were plant freaks. Met people that did prairie restorations. Tom Vanderpool, when I was working on this project in Chicago from Millennium Park, I had to just find out what we could grow. I went there with my drawings and spoke to people, what can we do and what will work. And so the prairie became a very big inspiration for me at that time. We did a lot of, every time I went there, I took a few days more in my schedule to just walk around. We traveled to places like Pittsburgh, steel factories, where you see people in this derelicted areas still were gardening with just annuals. People with Rick Dark, places, all steel factories that become now heritage. But the other thing is that what you see, that nature, when it takes over, and that not only native plants, but all plants from Europe, and they live in a sort of community that is very beautiful and inspirational. So what you see is that if you look at these pictures, if you come in places where you see where no one comes, or people come and don't recognize the beauty of it, you can see that in my work, it can be of help. You know, it's not that you try to copy, but you feel that you can do something with this. This is a field, an Alp in Croatia, and this is a garden I did. So you just try to copy it with a few plants that are similar, other plants that go well in their habitat. This is a prairie at the Morton Arboretum. This is what you can do in your own, for yourself, and you think, okay, how can I just transfer that image in a sort of public space or garden or landscape? I think that every time of the year has its own beauty. So look good, this is a sort of heavenly autumn-colored bushes in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. But you can see create a similar effect if you know that plants not only flower, but if you observe them, that they can look good after flowering as well. Let's see, nature and gardens. Yeah, so what we do, at least that's what I do, and the gardens, but we have a lot of people that we communicate with a lot of people from nature preserves and from the people that are no designers, but mainly ecologists and botanists. But we don't make gardens that are typical examples of nature, but they are conceptually inspired by nature and made. Very important in our work is that the landscape we do will look good year-round. Year-round, I mean, not a few days that you sit inside during a snowstorm at a fireplace, but I think mainly that the garden should look right from the beginning, when the first bulbs start to grow, and also in June, or July, August, or in November. So, and traditional gardening never gave you the idea, or gives you the idea that you should keep this. They would say, cut it down because it's November and make it ready for the winter. Yeah, we learn to appreciate a plant in decay, a plant that is starving or dead. The skeletons we learn to appreciate. I think that, so the future of planting design, and it's very short, I go very short because it's a very long discussion and I just put it as if it is true, but I think visually we like a more natural approach or naturalistic approach. The knowledge of plant ecology, or at least a greater awareness of long-term plant performance, is needed if you want to do this job. Ecologists whose profession does not involve much design could play a role in the management of designed plantings, what they now do in nature preservations of nature areas, planting design. So it's from a more traditional block planting, it goes more into a concept of where you use a number of plants that perform through the time. Traditionally, you can see that it was about decoration. Things were built up for summer, and if things were not performing, they would have been replaced. This is a traditional context, an estate in England for a traditional garden. Public space was, I think, in the 70s or earlier, let's say in the 19th century, public space was very important with their annuals and a lot of display in parks. But it was, I can say, by cutting back the money sources, budgets in municipals and in cities. A long time nothing was done in cities, but I think there's nowadays not all cities, but there's a lot of improvement in public space. People go for it. Architects are more interested in this. This is so the opposite of the context you saw, an estate or a house. So the urban is the context, the city is the context. So you see, this is where I work in, on a large scale public areas where planting is not only needed, but planting is appreciated, at least it is a good thing for the city. This is competitions were held for these parks, like Millennium Park. Here, this is the year 2000 with Gustafsson, a stage designer, and myself. We were just about to present for the competition. So this is a sort of the idea of the garden, that it had a sort of woodland, early flowering part. This is a roof of a garage, of a parking garage. A lot of, I go through this quickly. You see this whole, of course, it's a landscape architecture. On a larger scale, I work with landscape architects in the sense that I mainly focus on the planting design, and the landscape architect is the infrastructure and the hard landscaping. And that works very well as long as we don't fight about, if they don't fight about the plants and I don't fight about the sort of their ideas about landscape, and it works well with respect. You see, here we start planting first year, and that is more or less the result after 2-3 years. This is the sort of June aspects. So if we talk about seasons, you see that the rest of the garden is still coming up, and we call that that at a certain time the garden should, let's say, the garden should speak all times of the year. That's from the 17th floor from above. You see, in fact, the design is taken over on the ground, but you don't experience that when you're walking through it. A very natural sort of concept. This in Chicago was also a point where I found out that gardening was not traditionally just grouping plants together in a sort of combinations that would work well, but that you could do different. The winter is always important. And you see that you cannot think of it being sort of bare and without plants. The Battery in New York was a commission I got after 9/11. They asked me to do a horticultural master plan for the park with other landscape architects to start with the perimeter. We're still busy with it. It was a garden of remembrance. It was a tribute for the victims and family of 9/11. And it's at the tip where you can see, go to Governor's Island and to the Statue of Liberty. I'm still working on it, on the bikeway gardens. This is how it looked, as sort of boring annuals. This was the first year after, I think in 2002 already, or 2003. This was the interior, so under the woodland area. Very boring. No one would go there. There's 1 million or so people traveling from the ferries, a few millions a year. So we transformed that area also in a park where people would like to sit and to stay, and that you can people keep in a park is very important. That you can get their interest and because what I think with this sort of very dynamic landscapes, it's so energetic that and I think if you haven't seen it in gardens or your own garden, you wouldn't have seen it in parks at all, because it's very, very rare to see parks like this. But I could do it in America. I've done in Rotterdam some projects with success. But this was the start of my bigger work. So I jumped in 1996. I suddenly got a commission in Sweden near Stockholm, where I just got into a small public park, and from there and writing some books, I think a number of 7, that we came into more in connection with cities and competitions, architects, landscape architects. This is the Battery. The High Line in New York, I was involved in 94. So I think the High Line is new. No, this is in 1994, and they were already, 2004, sorry, 10 years later. That doesn't matter. But that sounds more interesting if I say 1994, but it was 2004. But this is how we found it. Here we came in with Diller's Video and field operations. For the first time we were up. They had been up, but I was asked also when they were on the short list to come in the team for the planting design of the High Line. This is how we walked it many times. Very interesting, very, very sort of beauty of its own, so wild, but they had to take everything out because the consequences when you want to let people up, then you have to, it's all about safety and regulations. So it had to be built. You see people were growing the Christmas trees, and it really was, this is what it is now, the same place. The first meeting with James Gorner, field operations, I still work with them on the Olympic Park for next year in London. And other places, we work on Section 3 of the High Line. It goes from Kensingford, 12th Street to 30th Street. Now we're going to around the corner of Western Rail Yards. You see, it's a mess when you start to clean up a place of which you think it's just a few plants, but it is it's a lot of rubble, and at a certain point it looks like a highway, a motorway. Now, me in the middle of my planting design, it is 2.5 kilometers long, so that is quite a bit, but very complex because I wanted to do something to jump from more traditional in something that really looked wild. So I had to work in layers. You can see underneath the papers another layer of a basic planting in which you create it's another. If I explain it, I only have 5 minutes, so I go quicker. But you see, this is the whole planting process. Bringing in the plants. They brought back all the rail lines. It was the opening from above, from the standard. This is in June, summer, June, July. Spring, you see, in spring you can already create by the patterns of the plants that you plant. You see, it looks very sort of unorganized, and but this is the summer, and this is autumn. This is the view from the auditorium, people walking. This is the sun deck area, which is now preserved. This is made by 100% native plants, American plants. We had I could normally talk an hour or more about all these projects, but you see there's different concepts. So every area you go, where you walk, it's different and looks different and feels different. That is what we try to do. This is August, I think. Winter. And diversity, if we talk about diversity and food and birds, it's a transmission area from birds that were first there's not so many birds in the city, maybe in the backyards. But it's nice to see a lot of birds and bees in this area, so that it is a place to feed. That was the next section, so that section 2, we just opened, I think, last spring. I was there last week. It looks better than now. It was not so bare. This is the sort of long walk towards the Western Railroad yards. Now, the last little project I want to show is what Peter Sumter, Serpentine Gallery, last year. You see, he wanted to make a hortus conclusus. A hortus conclusus is a garden inside, closed, and a sort of secret garden. And because of my work of the Biennale, he asked me to do this for his gallery last year. And it looked more like a lunchroom than a hortus conclusus. You can see people enjoyed. They took the coffee inside, and I think people. The only idea that people had of it, a nice building. We like the architects, and we feel good inside. I think that is so. This is how it evolved. We made the garden in June. The garden was not only made in June, it had to perform in July already, so a week after. So we brought in big plants, but in a sort of very complex, many varieties, so that it would grow till October when it was closing. So this is a detail, and this was, I think, I go back, and I think this is what I do. So that.
Piet, you say, sorry, this is the first time I said your first name to you, but
Piet?
Mr. Oudolf.
Okay.
You said a garden has to perform. What do you mean with that?
Perform, like, if it doesn't perform, we probably would pass it and not be attracted. So perform, I mean, in a sort of modest way, that it should connect you with green or with the beauty of things, remind you of nature sometimes, remind you of things you knew from when you were young. So a garden should remind you or bring you back to memories or bring you back to a sort of sense that we are not only living in cities, but also in green space and in an environment we should take care of.
So you don't mean performing as in the plants have to be really deeply yellow when I expect them to be?
Yeah, it's also design, yeah. So I think perform is the other kind. They should look good at a certain moment. Yeah. You know, if we don't look good, it's about characters or a play. It's a performance in time, so you could say that. It's like a stage play where plants grow and move and change. And that's how I see it. I see, because planting is not about what you do now, it's about how it will look in 3, 4, 5, or 10 years. And I can tell you that many of the gardeners in Chicago, they perform already for 10 years or longer without people telling me to redo it or to...
Somebody in the audience asked, is the winter in cities a special problem? How do you conceive the winter? I mean, most pictures are not in winter. You had some beautiful pictures out of the winter, but is it something that is a special category in the thinking of it?
No, yeah, it's part of the knowing. You know what plants do. They should be hardy. That's why I like to work in the temperate climate, so I could work from the north of Sweden till Siberia. But if you ask me to do something in a sort of a warmer climate, the tropics, I would probably say no, because it's not my system or my plant knowledge is not going that far.
You said in our conversation before, you said that in the old days, landscape designers and landscape architects were all very connected to the plants. This profession slowly evaluated in getting more into what you called architecture or design, more conceptual in a way. And you said, I never made that evaluation. I always stayed with the plants.
Yeah, but I work in concepts too. I have a rough idea and I transform that into a picture, I say. It sounds strange, but plants for me is sort of a way to express myself. So I use it as tools. But in fact, I'm very sort of not obsessed, but sincerely in touch with plants. And I know that in the past, in the time that parks were really places to go to with your children, and they were just display beds of everything, most garden or landscape architects, even from Central Park, they were plants people. They were people that were heavily not basically busy with the infrastructure. Yeah. And nowadays, a landscape architect is an architect in a way. It's very close and away from plants. Of course, they know what a tree is, but you know.
Yeah. Manuel, you are from New York. Half of his work is in New York.
Yes, and I must say that for us it's been quite an experience for New Yorkers to see your work and to live with it. I don't know if you have had a chance to see the work in the pictures, the High Line, and that's definitely been a very important new public space in New York. But the one thing that I wanted to mention that you were touching upon is that, for example, in New York, parks have always been considered public works endeavors and not, in a sense, really understood as landscaping projects. And that's one of the things that has really changed. The plants seem to talk to New York more than the space now, and that's really surprising and quite a beautiful experience.
Yeah, I can talk an hour about this and explain. It is what you see, and it's maybe more if you see it in real. So I think that is what it is. You know, the pictures look good, but when you're there, you probably know it connects you and it feels, and it is a people's place.
Yeah. One last question. You had a nursery as well for plants for a very long time. Yeah. Your wife was mostly involved with it. Yeah? Yes. What effect did this have on your designs?
Now that we could learn to know the plants, because plants are just like human creatures, you know, they grow, and if you need to know how they grow, you need to know how long they live, you need to know the competition they have with other plants. So the more you can only learn by experience. So that's why it took a long time. I worked for 30 years on plants, and I still make mistakes in the sense that things don't do what I like and think they will do. So it never will be 90%, 100% right. But the good thing is that that's why you always want to have it 100% right. That's why you go on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oudolf.
Thank you.